Okay, everybody. Hello. I have Frozen 2 playing in the other room, so my kids are taken care of for the time being. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about the beginnings of modern art, the Romantic movement, and then after that, the Impressionistic movement. So, just a reminder from Friday, some key mark uh, pointers about the modern era, a shift from religious centered art to human centered art. So, to recall, the Enlightenment is a shift for philosophers, thinkers, slightly away from religion and towards the humanist experience. Art makes the same shift in the Romantic era and even more so in the Impressionistic era, moving from um, religious centric art to more human centric art. Secondly, the explosion of artistic techniques and styles concurrent with industrial, scientific, and philosophical growth. So, you have in the modern era, uh, what I said last video, modernism is an explosion of the isms. So, all sorts of different styles and techniques develop in the modern era. That is because of, in a large part, because of a large um, increase in production of artistic elements such as tubes of oil paint, uh, better, easier access to canvas. It's also because you have a cultural exchange amongst people with the rise of colonialization in the 19th century. Uh, in the modern era, because people are seeking truth, and there is a separation, philosophical separation between what is true and what is good. While that separation existed, it's not as defined. It wasn't as defined as it is today, where there's a big distinction between what is good and what is true. But in the modern era, there is a sever between what is true and what is good. So rather than just being a quote unquote good work of art, people are thinking about how can I be different? How can I be unique from other people? And that becomes a driving influence for artists in the beginning of the modern era all the way until today. Uh, the reason why that break happened in the modern era was because a lot of people said, oh, well, I believe this to be good. Well, if you believe this to be good, why have we experienced so much bad? Primary example would be the Reformation and the split between the Protestant Church and the Catholic Church in the 16th century. Um, but that struggle happened over and over again throughout the modern era. I'd rather be different and unique than what you think of as good. Again, that divide between those two things begins to happen, but it's not totally divided in the beginning of the modern era. Reminder from Friday, modern art, like modern philosophy, holds universal truths to be real and important. Nature, human experience, effects of political, cultural struggles, that is to say, war. These things are universals, and they are as real and important as God Himself for the modernists. And they, uh, like Renaissance artists, painting God in His realness and His truthfulness, modernists are painting everyday human experiences and scenes because of their uh, hold, their claim on universal truth. Lastly, in modernism, you have a movement towards abstracted design. They are, rather than telling you a feeling, they are going to give you an opportunity to experience that feeling. So they're not going to tell you, I'm experiencing sadness here. They're going to show you something that is sad so that you're experiencing that. They're not going to tell you, this was a confusing moment in history. They are going to show you confusion so that you feel as confused. You participate in that confusion of the subject of that painting. Ultimately, not to tell you about truth, but to get you to experience truth itself. So that's a few pointers or reminders about the modern era, and particularly in the realm of art. Let's take a little look. We're going to start off with the Romantic era here. I'd like to start off showing you this painting. To be honest, I don't know who painted this, but I will tell you this. This is the very beginning of the Romantic era. It is a depiction of uh, so a battle, a naval battle between the French and British forces. Um, Notice it is, relatively speaking, clear, easy to read. It's as if it's giving you a picture of this military battle among between the French and British. This would have been very common. This is a British painting, by the way. So it would have been very common to see a style of painting like this in England, the beginning of the 19th century. Um, then a guy comes along, J.M.W. Turner, um, arguably one of the most famous British painters of all time. He starts painting uh, maritime paintings that look like this. Radically different than the other one. This is the fighting of the Temeraire, painted in 1838. You don't have, so this is a warship being towed into harbor by a coal burning tugboat. This is a painting honoring the death of a romantic ideal of sailboats for mechanized, mechanical, steam engine powered ships, which were messy and not as romantic as beautiful sailing ships that we saw in the other painting. But J.M.W. Turner wasn't known first and foremost for his painting of ships. He was known first and foremost for his painting of the atmosphere. And yes, this is a painting about a boat, but it's actually a painting about the environment, the world set aflame with beauty and grandeur and awesomeness. This is an experience of the mysterium tremendum, the experience of being overwhelmed by the mystery, the power of creation, God's creation. So Turner's paintings were met with a lot of criticism and great applause, depending on who you were as one of his contemporaries. People either loved his paintings or hated them, but everybody talked about him and his work. Here you have on the right a totally abstracted skyline. Like, and no sky looks like this in real life, but when you look at this, you feel like the sky is on fire, which is exactly what you might say if you see a really vivid sunset. You would say something like, wow, that sky is on fire. Well, he might have heard somebody say that, so he painted that, so that rather than just talking about a naval ship sailing into harbor on a beautiful sunset day, you get to experience that. Meanwhile, in Germany, you have artwork in the Romantic era that begins to look like this. These are two paintings by the most famous German Romantic painter, Caspar David Friedrich. He painted in the early 19th century. On the left, you have a painting, The Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, painted in 1818, the same year Slough is founded. Here you have a man ascending a rock within his purview a valley covered in fog. This painting is as if to suggest man as the organizer and leader and captain of all of creation. You can imagine God being this person overlooking his creation. But here, God is depicted as a man in typical garb of the era. It is perfectly balanced, relatively symmetrical, even in its values and contrast. It is a really well organized, well executed painting. On the right, also by Caspar David Friedrich, you have The Sea of Ice, painted in 1823, also known as The Wreck of Hope. So when you look at this, it looks like these almost boulder-like things, very heavy, massive, sharp, dangerous rocks. These rocks are actually ice. And when you look at this, you see the power of ice collapsing in on itself and rising to make these deadly looking peaks. And the more you look at this painting, you begin to see, particularly right here, the remains of a ship being crushed by nature. Again, Just like Turner is capturing uh, the fire of the sky and the power of nature, Caspar David Friedrich's doing the same thing, reminding humans that we are tiny, minuscule created beings at the whims of nature and the truth of nature's power. Turner, and even more so Friedrich, are known as transcendentalist painters because they are trying to convey beauty, truth, goodness in the sense of awesomeness in everyday natural scenes. They are reminding us that we are small beings in a much larger symphony, and that we have both the power to participate and organize creation, but we also have the responsibility, the obligation to endure or be part of a small part of creation. And that however big and important we think we are, God and God's creation are even bigger. In France, we have paintings that look like this. Whereas the English and the German aren't depicting human forms, the French in the Romantic era are all about painting the human figures. Um, this correlates strongly with their political philosophy. If you think of the 19th century and late 18th century, the French revolutions, the Napoleonic Empire, then more French republics following that. It's all about the struggle of the classes and the struggles of one human against another. On the left, you have a very famous painting painted by Eugene Delacroix, Liberty Leading Her People, painted in 1830s. This painting in real life is massive. It's like 8 foot by 10 foot. On the right, you have The Death of Marat by Jacques David, painted in 1793. Both of these paintings are two of the most iconic paintings from the French Revolution. On the left, Lady Liberty, Liberty depicted as a woman with her breasts exposed, nourishing the rising proletariat of the French people, leading them to victory and a better, more nourishing life. Reminding the French people of the struggle, the costs. You have laying at her feet the death of people, also stripped of their clothing in sacrifice. On the right, a much more tranquil, peaceful, balanced, harmonious painting. You have The Death of Marat. Marat was a very notorious French revolutionary journalist who was murdered for his cause, for his beliefs. In neither of these depictions do you have anything about religion. This is all about humanism and human philosophy, rights, equality, justice, and the sacrifices that those things occur. So, an adherence to a reverence for truth and the sacrifices needed to make those things happen. And in Spain, so we have England, Germany, France, now off to Spain. You look here, you have what we had for today's prayer, the 3rd of May, 1808. On the left, on the right, you have Saturn devouring his sun. These are both painted by Francisco de Goya, one of my personal favorite painters. This painting on the left is considered to be, arguably, people will say this is the first modern painting. If you want to learn more about this painting, for the sake of time, I will just direct you to our introduction to check that out. But in terms of paint, what I want to talk about, why this is really unique, is you begin to see, if you go back to these other paintings, I'm going to go back for a second, you see really intricate, perfectly done stuff. And on this, hold on. Hey, Francis, go somewhere else. I'll be there in a minute. Teaching from home. Here you have, if you look at the brushwork in here and over here, this is really, really abstracted, really loose brushwork. It's not precise, it's not accurate, but it does convey a spirit or a message or an essence Again, modernist painters are trying not so much to convey the exact um, photographic replication of what they're seeing, but rather they're trying to convince you or draw you into a feeling or a state of being that these people, these subject matters themselves would have felt. At the end of Francisco de Goya's life, he really started becoming a recluse. He would not go out a lot. He started also losing his mind. Um, Here you have Saturn devouring his son. This is an allusion to Spain almost devouring itself. It was going through a serious civil strife amongst itself when Napoleon basically took charge during the Peninsula Wars. Spain was trying to figure out who it was, and while it was doing that, it was also destroying itself. Also, Francisco de Goya was seriously worrying about what his life, towards the end of his life, what death would mean for him. How would he be remembered? What would happen to his soul at death? Francisco de Goya doesn't carry with him the same religious orthodoxy or beliefs that maybe a generation or two at the end of the Baroque would have felt. So he is far more terrified about the end of death. Now we have the beginning of the Impressionist movement. So, whereas the Romantic era was focusing heavily on transcendence, truth amidst nature, the power of nature, the power of death and suffering and war, the Impressionist era are still trying to find transcendence, but they're trying to do so in maybe more subtle, less dramatic ways. You can think of remember the Romantic era is coming right after the Baroque, so there's still a flair for the drama that was also common in the Baroque. In the Impressionist era, you are going to have the same amount of focus on transcendence in everyday things, but it's going to be in more subtle depictions, more subtle subject matter. These are two classic Impressionist paintings. On the left, you have poppies. It's a field of poppies depicted by Claude Monet. On the right, by Edward Manet, you have boating. I have these two pictures here just to say that these are two classic subject matters. Again, very subtle, ordinary daily scenes that are quintessential of Impressionistic art. On the left, you just have a simple pastoral landscape. On the right, you have a simple everyday scene. In this case, unknown man and unknown woman going for a little sail out on a lake. Arguably one of the greatest Impressionists, if not the most famous Impressionist painter, was Claude Monet. He's most famous for his water lilies, which many of you might recognize or see. If you don't know what his water lilies are, you should Google them and check them out. But I want to show you this painting, or this series of paintings. Here you have the Rouen Cathedral, painted in the 1890s. Claude Monet is known to be a quote-unquote painter of light. He was concerned what are the color properties of light. When you think of light, you take light for granted, but every light has all sorts of infinite amount of colors in it. So he spent about 2 to 3 years painting in the plaza in front of the cathedral in Rouen, France, and he painted different times a day to talk about the nature of light. So here you have this brick and mortar cathedral, and there's 12 different paintings here. Each painting looks radically different than the next in regards to the color. While the subject matter and composition are exactly the same, the colors are totally different. This is particularly sophisticated because if you think back to Gothic architecture and what Gothic ecclesial architecture tried to do, remember it brought in vaults and buttresses to allow greater, much more expansive windows in the cathedral to make the cathedral a building of light. Claude Monet is playing off of that idea that these are buildings of light And he is depicting this throughout the day to say, here, even the stone itself, by the use of light, can change. So even these inanimate objects are becoming animate. This is the truth of these materials. The truth of light is that it brings life to even inanimate things. It is a beautiful, beautiful impressionistic statement, purely quintessentially modernistic belief. While Claude Monet might be the most famous impressionist, the most beloved impressionist is this guy, Vincent van Gogh. This is a cafe where he would have lived when he was painting. He tries to make, much like Claude Monet with his Rouen Cathedral, tries to make ordinary scenes feel like they start shimmering with life. Here you have a vineyard. Vincent van Gogh was a really, he's known for having chopped off his ear and having killed himself, unfortunately. But he was an extremely sensitive person. He had a pretty tough life. He's the son of a preacher. He himself tried to become a preacher. It did not work out. He tried a number of other jobs. They also did not work out. And then he finally picked up painting because it was the one thing he truly loved to do. It brought him the most peace in his life. And typical to the Impressionistic movement, his paintings are not obviously religious, but being a deeply spiritual and person with a deep religious upbringing, all of his paintings feel like they are shimmering with transcendent or divine life. So here you have the vineyard playing off of the idea of Jesus talking about the vineyard. I am the vine, you are the branches, from the Gospel of John. He is saying, here is an ordinary vineyard. The Son is the Son of God. He brings life to this vineyard. He is the vine, we are the branches. The Son also represents God the Father, bringing life to his creation, in this case the vineyard, but also us. Here you have two of his self-portraits. This is towards the earlier part of his career. This is one of the last self-portraits he painted of himself. Of note, and what I really want to talk about with this self-portrait is notice this background painting. If you notice the subject matter, you have two what looks to be geishas or Japanese figures here. Vincent van Gogh was influenced by a lot of different artists in his life, but one of the things that towards the end of his career that was really influential to him was Japanese printmaking. In fact, it was influential to tons of different late Impressionists, early modernists. They were really influenced by Japanese art. So you'll notice a lot of Vincent van Gogh's artwork isn't in the traditional perspective or have accurate depth. That is very common with a lot of different traditional Romantic and even early Impressionist art. Vincent van Gogh foreshortens a lot of his paintings, certainly inspired by Japanese art, which didn't have the same use of 1 and 2 point perspectives that we had in the West. This is Vincent van Gogh's last painting, A Field of Crows. Again, perspective is shortened. Everything is thick paint coming to life, extremely vibrant in terms of color hue. And while he's using primary colors, reds, yellows, blues, there's something really, and they feel very vibrant, there's something really, really sad and dark and scary about this. These paths go nowhere. These crows are coming, sort of an ominous, giving an ominous feel to it. He is struggling. He doesn't know where to go. He is lost. And this becomes a very major trend in modernist art, is a sort of nihilism, whereas nothing really matters, or maybe a despair. This becomes very common, especially in Europe, after World War I, and then all subsequently after World War II, which we'll talk more about tomorrow. So that's it for now. I just want to end here with a quote from Vincent van Gogh, which I think is really beautiful and good for us in our humanities class. Love many things, for therein lies the true strength. And whosoever loves much performs much, and can accomplish much. And what is done in love is done well. Amen. Thanks, everybody.